Good morning and welcome to the Home Affairs Select Committee. Sorry for the slightly late start this morning. This is our last session on our inquiry into non-contact sexual offences, and the aims for this session are to explore the current policing response to non-contact sexual offences, including the potential for data to inform that response and any challenges to utilising that data, to understand what more can be done across the criminal justice system to prevent these offences, identifying perpetrators and bringing them to justice, and providing effective support to victims and survivors, and then to question the Minister about issues raised so far during the inquiry and within her remit. So welcome very much to our first panel this morning. I'd like each of you to introduce yourselves. If we could start perhaps with Commander Russell. If you could just say who you are, who you're representing, that would be very helpful.
No problem. Good morning. It's Commander Ben Russell from the Metropolitan Police. I'm the Commander for Intelligence and Covert Policing.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Deputy Chief Constable Maggie Blyth. I'm the National Police Chief's Lead on tackling violence against women and girls. I'm also the Deputy Chief Constable at the National College of Policing.
Morning, Temporary ACC Paul Furnell. I'm at British Transport Police and I'm in charge of and strategic lead for VORG.
Good morning, Louisa, Rolfe, Assistant Commissioner from the Metropolitan Police, responsible for Frontline Policing, and the National Police Chiefs Council Lead for Domestic Abuse.
Thank you. We're very pleased to see all of you today. I wondered if I could start us off actually with DCC Blyth about the you're obviously the main person in dealing with violence against women and girls, and I wondered if you could just set out, since you've been in post, what your main achievements have been.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for inviting me to give evidence this morning, both as the National Police Chief's Lead in tackling violence against women and girls, and I would want to emphasise I work across many other NPCC leads, such as Assistant Commissioner Louisa, Rolfe. We very much coordinate together. In terms of what I think I'd like to sort of set out really this morning is what we've done over the last 2.5 years, but also the importance of the national coordination that we feel we need to maintain to provide a consistent and coordinated response across our 43 forces. I think it's also worth reiterating that as we tackle these crimes, we have to set out what the threat is, be really clear about the level of threat, and I think that's really well understood. We've published in the last couple of years, and we're doing this annually, a strategic threat risk assessment in the same way that we tackle any other crime like terrorism, serious and organised crime. And that really has helped us draw out and focus on domestic abuse as a volume crime, rape and serious sexual offending, child sexual exploitation and abuse, and that's important both in terms of the impact on victims, but just the numbers of perpetrators we're talking about, and then the online threat. So in pulling out and setting that threat assessment, we're quite methodical in understanding what we're dealing with. And I was going to share with you as a starter some of that headline data as well. It's been really helpful to have VORG, and if you don't mind me using the term VORG for, it's not always an easy acronym to explain, but those crime types that sit within this level of violence. Really helpful to have VORG placed within the strategic policing requirement, because I think that's, again, allowed us to approach our policing response in the same way that we tackle counter-terrorism and serious and organised crime. So over the last 2 years, we've mobilised every 43 of our police forces around VORG. We set our first national framework in 2021, setting out those key threats and expecting every police force to self-assess against that in preparation for inspection from HMICFRS. We've reinvigorated that framework in the last 6 weeks, using and adopting the police doctrine of a 4P approach, which is very much around pursue, prevent, protect and prepare, and again, very similar to how we approach terrorism and serious organised crime. It's important to have that national coordination and that national framework so that we can initiate consistency across 43 forces and to allow the guidance, the training, the approach to be as consistent as possible in how we pursue largely the men who are violent towards women, not always, male victims too, but our data shows that this is predominantly a crime perpetrated by men. It's also allowed us to set out the evidence base, and a big part of that evidence base in the last 2 years has been initiated by Op Ceteria, which I think, Chair, you and colleagues are familiar with, as an approach to, a very much a new approach to understanding the perpetrators behind rape and sexual offending, and this is, I think, relevant to what we're going to discuss today, but allowing us to use that evidence base across other crimes that sit within VAUG, particularly domestic abuse. 1 in 3 rapes is domestic abuse linked, and we know that stalking and harassment underpins much of the sorts of crimes we're talking about. So having that evidence base set by Ceteria and using it as to inform guidance and training elsewhere has been really important.
So that sounds very impressive. Lots of strategies and reinvigoration and lots of the 4 Ps and Operation Ceteria we've heard lots about.
Yeah.
Drilling down then into this particular issue that we're concerned about, the non-contact sexual offending, how does that fit?
Yeah.
How does that actually impact all that framework you've got around it? What does it actually mean in terms of police response to non-contact sexual offending?
Really important to set out that framework because it evidences the level of the epidemic, and our data has shown that 1 in 10 people are victims of the crimes that sit under VAUG. We estimate that 1 in 15 people are perpetrators of these types of crimes. So
let's get that. Sorry, 1 in 10 people. I mean, we're talking about women, aren't we? 1 in 10 women.
Not entirely, because some, if we look at under 16s, we know that some victims are boys, and we also know that some victims of these types of crimes are also male as well. So we know it's predominantly affecting
women
and impacting women, but not entirely.
Okay.
We also know that predominantly the perpetrators are male.
You're saying 1 in 15?
In terms of an estimate against the scale of what we're dealing with, and I wanted to start with the scale because that includes non-contact as well as contact. If we're looking at all of those crimes that sit within VAUG, from child abuse, exploitation, through to domestic abuse, to rape and serious sexual offending, to the online threat, our estimates, and looking at ONS data, looking at the data we're collecting, we're really, really concerned about the scale that we're dealing with. And that's important then for the policing response. We think the policing response, largely around pursue, and Commander Russell will talk about some of the approaches the Met are taking around going after the men that commit these crimes using a data-informed approach. But the scale is so huge to include non-contact and contact that it requires more than just a policing response.
Okay.
So we have to be held to account on our response, but we do urge the panel to understand the scale that we're dealing with.
I mean, I think one of the problems we've come across is the lack of data on non-contact sexual offending for various reasons, which I'm sure we're going to come on to. But what would you say, though, about non-contact sexual offending in terms of, you're saying VAUG is an epidemic?
Yes, absolutely.
Non-contact sexual offending. I've said before, I think most women would say at some stage in their lives they have been subjected to non-contact sexual offending, either a man exposing himself or unwanted touching or something, not unwanted touching, but exposure is the main one. What would you say about that in terms of most women would say they've been subject to that?
I think you're absolutely correct in saying, again, we only know what is reported into policing, and we accept the scale of non-contact sexual offending is wider than what is reported into policing. We cannot find research that demonstrates an absolute correlation between non-contact sexual offending and going on to commit more serious sexual offending. But my professional advice, and colleagues as well here today, will say absolutely there will be some link. It doesn't necessarily mean non-contact offending determines an absolute escalation to go on to commit more serious sexual offending. But a preoccupation looking into patterns of offending would indicate that those again, largely men that commit non-contact sexual offending may have a propensity to go on to commit more concerning offending. So it is something that we need to be able to target. We need to be able to understand, as we would approach any other investigation, that there will be red flags should, for example, somebody have committed indecent exposure and then gone on to commit other types of
I'm going to move on
crime.
to James Daly in a moment, but why do you think it is that the police have been so poor at dealing with non-contact sexual offending in the past? Why have they not recognised it as a problem?
I think there's three things here. I think policing reflects society, and I think as a society we haven't placed weight on these crime types, and I think since the pandemic and since some of the awful murders of women that have gained an understanding across the public that's changing things. I think secondly is the scale, and the scale that we're talking about means more than just a policing response. Thirdly, I think we are recognising this is now a threat like terrorism, but we are still, and we recognise we still have an enormous long way to go.
Thank you. James Daly.
Deputy Chief Constable, I just have to pick you up on one of the statements you've made. It may well be true. It's very depressing if it is true. But if we're in this position because the police effectively have not taken the offences we're talking about seriously, that is a great indictment to the police over the last decade, isn't it?
I think, and the evidence that I was putting forward is in our society we have not approached these crimes that often happen behind closed doors, some in public spaces, but often behind closed doors. We haven't had an understanding of those, and we haven't equipped, not just within policing, but within society to how we deal with them. I believe that's changing.
I appreciate that, but that's just an excuse, isn't it? I mean, to say that the police reflect society's, faults or whatever is a very sad state of affairs. Your law enforcement officers who have offences to prosecute, and just because, I don't know whether you would call it institutional misogyny or a lack of taking offences seriously, is a disgrace, personally. And the public have been badly let down by the police, haven't they?
We absolutely know that we have a significant way to go in improving our policing response to these crime types, but I do believe we're changing, and I do believe, I've worked in this field of public protection all my career, I think society is changing in the same way. Crime is evolving all the time, and particularly the online crime is something that 10 years ago we would have not had the knowledge of in the way that we do, and how some of the underpinning concerns around stalking and harassment are utilised, and how online crime perpetuates that.
Can I ask the other members of the panel, in respect of various offending types, I ask variations of this theme because when you look at the data that is put forward, especially in respect of rape and the amount of, we're not talking specifically about that, but it falls within the type of offending that we're all discussing here today. The charging rate is ludicrously low, and there may well be many reasons for that. But if I just give you an example, and I'll come to data in a second, is that at the end of March 2023, according to the figures that I have here, that there were approximately, 68,949 rape offences reported to the police. There were 1,685 convictions. Now, that's what I'm reading here. That's from the internet. But if you just put that into context, that's beyond belief. It is literally beyond belief. That's not even charge outright, that's convictions. So out of the 68,000 people in the year 2023, only less than 2,000 of them had a conviction. Now, I think there's a huge problem with how matters are prosecuted in your relationship as police officers with the Crown Prosecution Service, and I think they present barriers which are very difficult for the police to overcome. And I have spoken to police officers in this area who say that essentially for offences of this nature, the Crown Prosecution Service are applying evidence that amounts to a slam dunk. That unless you've got the effective confession signed in blood or the very, very strong evidence, there is little chance of a charge. And I just wonder whether you feel that is impacting how seriously these matters are taken by the police. Yeah.
Chair, if I may, I think Operation Soteria gave us a really good insight into what is going on here. The National Lead for Rape and Sexual Offences, Chief Constable Sarah Crew from Avon and Somerset, I know she's previously spoken to this committee about that work, but Operation Soteria identified a number of things, and the Crown Prosecution Service have been working closely with policing on a joint national action plan, and we have seen through CPS data that I agree with you, the prosecution rate is far too low, and there's been work together to improve that and significantly address it. And in the Met alone, in the last year, 500 more cases prosecuted than the previous year of rape, but also policing managing significant increase, a 244% increase in reporting.
In terms of non-contact sexual offences, could you give us an idea of the if there's been an increase in prosecution in respect of rape? Has that been reflected in the offences we're talking about here today?
So I would need to come back to you on the increase, but I do know the data in terms of reporting of exposure and voyeurism in the last year, 1,566 offences and a positive outcome rate, so a charge of 10.9%. We would like it to be more. But going back to Operation Soteria, their key findings for policing nationally, and forces have really grasped this, and through Maggie's leadership and working with her and Sarah and their teams, really understanding. So we have an adversarial justice system where the burden of proof is on the prosecution. I know you know this, but the burden of proof is on the prosecution to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that a crime has occurred. It's not always suited to behaviour-based crime, and particularly we find the conviction rate for stranger offences is higher than for offences that occur within a relationship. I know as the domestic abuse lead there is a 1/3 overlap between domestic abuse and rape and sexual offences. We also know that often sexual offences are ways that perpetrators will seek to control their victim. It's a horrific thing, but we've also found that our adversarial justice system, we found that it was leading police and prosecutors to be overly focused on the veracity of a victim's account and insufficiently focused on the behaviour of perpetrators, and therefore we might be...
Can you explain what that means?
Yes, of course. So if the burden of proof is on the prosecution to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that an offence occurred...
The comment you made regarding the veracity of the complaint...
So actually ensuring that the case you put forward is watertight. And I think this comes out in society as well. So you'll all recall the news about, celebrity cases, and then the media's intrusive focus on whether the victim is perfect rather than the offender's behaviour.
I have to say, I completely agree with you. You explained it far more articulately than I did, but that has to have an impact. And one of the things when we're talking about this debate is the conviction rates in court are not really the issue, because the conviction rates are, I won't say acceptable, but they are within us. Everything can always be improved. The major problem, and if I could just move on to the next witness, is the referral rate from the police to the Crown Prosecution Service for these types of offences. And Temporary Assistant Chief Constable Furnell, I just wonder what your general view is in respect to this, because I take the view, unless I'm wrong, that police want to prosecute people if they think there is evidence that they should go before a court. But this isn't happening. Why?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd echo both Maggie and Louisa's comments around societal problem needing a societal response. I agree totally with that. And one of the impacts of those rates that you've just referred to is a lack of confidence in the public, in victims and survivors of those offences in reporting. British Transport Police are the 44th force, so 43 plus 1. We're outside of obviously the Home Office jurisdiction. And we recognised that in 2019 and did some academic research at the time to understand what we could do to increase reporting around non-contact sexual offending. And I'm pleased to report that we've doubled our figures over that last 4 or 5 years in non-contact reporting. That's had an impact on our solve rate. They're nowhere near where we as British Transport Police or UK policing want it to be. But that increased confidence and staying with those investigations has been really critical for us. We listened to the survivors and victims' voice during that period, and one of the things that's critical, coming back to your point, Chair, was that some of the feedback we had from survivors that not everyone wished in the non-contact space to pursue a judicial outcome. And so one of the major things that we've concentrated on in British Transport Police is listening to that voice and creating different pathways of reporting and recording from the traditional one route only into a prosecution. So we currently, as a force, you can report non-contact sexual offending anonymously and in confidence, and we will honour the confidentiality of that reporting, because our priority is focusing our attention on identification of the perpetrator and looking at early identification intelligence programs to deal with that perpetrator. And that may be through civil orders, it may be through criminal orders, hopefully. But the benefits we've seen in that is we've also developed an offender management program that's outside of the VISA program of high harm offenders with RISE in partnership at looking at some of the behaviour, because we're not saying that every man in the non-contact space is a sexual predator, because some of them aren't. Some of it's about behaviour change and identification of the risks that they present, and our intelligence programme over that 5 years has been able to identify those through a streamlined process.
Thank you. Just one very brief question for Commander Russell. If this is, in terms of your experience of prosecuting the offences we're talking about here today, and the relationship with the Crown Prosecution Service, because I'm assuming that you have some form of, your oversight in respect of what happens in the Met in respect of that. If a victim comes forward and the evidence is a witness statement to say, this has happened to me, is it generally the case that the Crown Prosecution Service will say that a witness statement with nothing else is not sufficient to mount a charge?
I don't think we could generalise that.
That is the case in many circumstances, isn't it?
So I mean, we've probably, all of us on the panel have seen circumstances where you look at a case and you think it's a very good one and it hasn't gone the way we want it to go. And every case will be different, but I think we can all, excuse me, we can all probably think of those cases. I guess the probably only other thing I'd add, completely agreeing with all my colleagues, is it's not all about prosecution. Often our goal is around just reducing harm. So, as my colleague has said, civil orders are really powerful. Also, I guess another thing is, even when people are in prison, sometimes they keep offending. So we know of offenders who will continue to harass their victims, even from within prison. So I think we have to look at the whole kind of life cycle of an offender and the needs of a victim quite a bit more in the round. I kind of completely take the point you're making, but it's not
I understand, but
always
you're not a social worker, right? You're there to enforce the law. Much as I appreciate that, that's all great still. If somebody commits an offence, they should go before a court, shouldn't they?
Yeah, and one of the good things we can do is with civil orders, we can take a case to court on the balance of probabilities rather than on beyond reasonable doubt, and have much more chance of success when putting restrictions around someone. We can put in place restrictions where they can't form a relationship without permission from the police, where they can't approach women in the street. There's all kind of very strong powers that we can use, and there's others on the panel who know more about this than me, but that are really powerful, and probably we want to make more use of them as well as prosecute and take more cases through the criminal justice system.
Thank you, Chair.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. DCC Blyth, you mentioned in your opening comments about violence against women and girls reaching epidemic, or described it as an epidemic. But I'd be curious to know, in terms of the work that's been undertaken across the country in the 43 forces, you mentioned that they undertake a self-assessment. In terms of consistency and review of monitoring of that approach, who does that and how well is it working?
Thank you. Really important question. 43 forces, different ways of responding and approaching. We've wanted to look at consistency. So the answer to your question is HMI CFRS, the Inspectorate. Those self-assessments are of interest to inspectors when they come in to do their what are called peel inspections on general effectiveness. They also sometimes do deep dive inspections into particular areas they've just completed in terms of rape and serious sexual offending. So though we've worked hand in hand with colleagues in HMI CFRS to ensure that the stick element, I guess, of setting out guidance, the enforcement element of making sure that this remains a priority is undertaken through inspection.
And in terms of non-contact sexual offences, we've heard that the collection of data is not great. And part one of Angelini talked about raising the profile and raising awareness. I was just, again, how are those 43 forces looking at doing that in practice?
Thank you. In two ways, really. One, through the work that we're doing under the umbrella of VORG, of recognising that non-contact offences committed by a perpetrator are part of the intelligence gathering, the golden hour of investigation when anyone, a PCSO, anyone at local level has turned up to respond. So making sure that the perpetrator behaviour is understood. In the same way that looking at organised criminality, looking at terrorist profiles, we're wanting to ensure that skills training is understood at the front line. That's one way. The second way is actually encouraging and ensuring that people report it in. And I think the challenge we have with non-contact sexual offences is we only know part of the picture. We only at the moment, I think we accept a loss of confidence from our public reporting these crime types in. We want to encourage women and girls and anyone, boys and men too, to report in and to continue to build up that picture from data. But our data is still quite poor in this area.
And do you believe that people have the confidence in terms of reporting in that action will be taken? Because we heard from police last week in terms of poor resources, in terms of dealing with retail crime, for example. Does the same apply to this particular type of offence?
It's really important that women and girls and our members of our public feel that they can report these in and feel confident to report to us. I talk to stakeholders all over the country for different organisations that represent members of the public, and this is top of the agenda, the trust and confidence element. We want to work with stakeholders nationally, but also forces at local level have their own links and engagement. So some interesting examples of where we're trying to improve that trust and confidence are through independent advisory groups, working with local members of the community to come in some forces actually look at decisions that have been made by policing around these crime types. So try and encourage a greater understanding of what we do and why we think it's important.
Thank you. AC Rolfe, we know that the accessibility of online porn has contributed to a rise in sexual offences, and particularly in terms of young males having access. So I was just curious in terms of whether any research has been undertaken in terms of the progression from non-contact sexual offences to other more serious offences, and whether that's available.
Thank you for the question. I know that there's research from many years ago that identifies a clear link between exposure to extreme pornography and pornography particularly that includes violence against women, and those exposed to it having a sort of having a dehumanising impact, and people seeing violence against women as more acceptable. In terms of recent research that shows that non-contact offending definitely leads to contact or harmful offending, I think at the moment there's a gap, and I think there's a mixed picture. We, of course, in policing would love for there to be more research that could help us, but also there's plenty for us to be getting on with. So we've been doing an awful lot of work in London. I'm working closely with the College of Policing and the National Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force to understand how do we really pick up those findings from the Angelini report about our officers being professionally curious for focusing on offenders, the findings from Operation Soteria about focusing on offenders, finding the links, the patterns. We've ensured that we're reviewing our information about cases so that we're looking at patterns of offending, linking cases, being really clear about our commitment to attend incidents of indecent exposure or voyeurism or other non-contact sexual offences, and tracking that attendance closely, tracking our response to victims. So an awful lot to help us understand the picture, but fundamentally to ensure that victims receive the right and the best service from policing, and that we are very offender focused and can identify those escalations. And we've had some really notable success. The work that Ben is leading in terms of understanding our data to who is posing the greatest threat and who should we prioritise our resources and focus upon. So a lot of work in development, but at the moment certainly a gap in that independent academic research.
And Commander Russell, in terms of the Met, do you have dedicated teams that are looking at these types of crimes? and how frequently is training rolled out to officers to make sure, because I'm aware that officers tend to move to different teams on a fairly regular basis.
So we deal with, in terms of dedicated teams, it will depend on the type of offending. Definitely at the most serious end, that's the case. One of the things we've done recently is with indecent exposure cases, we've moved all those investigations, actually not that recent, we've moved all those investigations into our specialist CID teams. So they would get a more specialist response, I think, than they're used to. The reality, though, is, of course, investigating these offences is the job for every police officer. So I guess it's a scale.
Can I just be clear then, the specialist team, is that the specialist RASO team that you're saying?
Yeah, that's an example, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's an example. Could I just ask, before I move on to Tim, DCC Blyth, not all police forces have specialist teams, do they?
That's absolutely correct, yes.
And they should?
We definitely want a cohort of investigators specially trained to deal with these crime types. The challenge with specialist teams for some of our smaller forces is a capacity issue, so that there are examples now of collaboration across a regional area, and I would want to promote that, because I think specialist training is really important, but we can't dictate one model on the different 43 forces, and that's largely geography as much as anything.
Are you able to tell us which forces don't have RASOs? It sounds like the smaller ones.
Could certainly provide that information to you separately, but it tends to be smaller organisations who, if you create a specialist team, you're taking officers off another response activity.
And they should all do what the Met's done, which is to put these non-contact sexual offending into the RASO specialist teams to deal with this issue of being able to see patterns and identify
We're really promoting bringing together experts in domestic abuse, RASO, bringing that together under the umbrella of public protection and beefing up our public protection response. So every force has a public protection unit. We want to ensure that those public protection units are adequately trained and supported.
Okay, thank you.
So just to be really clear, so rape and serious sexual offence teams will deal with rape and serious sexual offences. What I was trying to say is, separate to that, we've then got frontline officers who will pick up volume crime. We also have CID, so kind of more complex crime. What we've done is we've not moved indecent exposure into the RASO teams, we've moved it into our complex crime CID teams.
There is a view that should happen, because then you'd be able to have that experience and knowledge about how indecent exposure and other non-contact offences could feed into the broader picture. But you're saying not in the Met, it goes to CID.
It's a volume problem.
Yeah. I mean,
it's a volume. Oh, okay.
I think the other issue we can overcome with this is ensuring that there's adequate training, specialist training programs that those individuals who are working in a particular area can undertake and become accredited for. And that's certainly the approach we've taken with RASO and want to replicate.
Thank you, Chair. EC Rolfe, can I pick up on what you've just been saying? I mean, the main reason we launched this inquiry was, one, I think we're concerned with the very high levels of non-contact sexual offences that were not being pursued and resulting in criminal action, and of course some high-level cases, including, unfortunately, police officers who've gone on to commit some very serious sexual offences who had serious form in exposure and other lower-level non-contact offences earlier on. You've just described that sort of progression as a bit of a gap and a mixed picture. So how does it actually work at the moment? If you get reports of an individual who is exposing himself in a public place or privately or something like that, but without a lot of evidence to go with it, i.e., photographs and multiple witnesses, but some random reports, where does that lead? And will you do some greater analysis to put together those different, hold on, he was doing that there and somebody else was reporting that there appears to be something more to it than just an odd incident? How does that actually work practically?
So I could probably best to illustrate with an example. So about 18 months ago, we had reported to us an indecent exposure. I think it was in the Maida Vale area of London near Paddington Basin. And one of our crime intelligence analysts spotted that there'd been a couple of other similar offences nearby. And we looked at the pattern of offending And as a result of identifying a number of linked offences, we found some ANPR camera footage that identified a moped ridden by somebody who was a food delivery driver. We were able to pursue some other lines of inquiry, and we then found a series of linked offences that matched this delivery driver's working pattern of deliveries, and we were able to charge and prosecute that individual because of joining the dots. And this is the key finding from Operation Soteria, the recommendation from Angelini of really clearly joining the dots and ensuring that we use our data. So, being really clear about patterns of offences. The Met has just moved to a new system for the recording of crime and intelligence that is based on a poll database. So it absolutely enables us to connect people, objects, locations and events that will identify and flag if we are seeing a series. So if something had a similar registration number or a similar modus operandi of an offender or in a similar location or a similarly described person, we would be in a position to identify connections and pursue lines of inquiry. The wonderful thing about working in a big city like London is there is so much CCTV footage, ANPR cameras, ring doorbells, things that our investigators can pursue. And what's been really clear, we make no secret of the fact we have a lot of work to do, but our determination to be really focused on ensuring that we do not miss these opportunities, the learning from those horrific cases you described, whether that is offending behaviour, and we are very focused on ensuring that there is no place for abusers within policing, and whether that's in terms of tightening our vetting or pursuing cases and learning from the events of the past. We are very determined in that, but also in investigating cases.
So my concern is that all sounds as though it's worked very well. My concern is when a dot then becomes part of a pattern of dots that you proactively try to join up, and the capacity you have for that sort of analytics as well. Now, we all get complaints as constituency MPs, I'm sure, about a crime that's been reported to the police. There may even be video evidence, but then the police are reluctant to take it forward. Now, in the past, probably, there have been cases where somebody might take the trouble to report to the police, that somebody exposed themselves in front of me, and the response may be, well, do you know who it is? Do you know where he's from? Have you seen him do it several times? Is he from there or whatever? And if the answer to most of those questions is no, then it's usually a case of, well, don't call us, we'll call you, rather than, okay, we're going to check all the VT possibly available for cameras in that area. So what has changed, if anything has changed now, that you're more proactively saying, right, thank you very much for that bit of evidence, let's see if we can match it up with other bits of evidence, and we've now got this whizzy analytical, and you've launched in the Met this V100 initiative as part of your action plan announced at the end of last year. Why is this more likely to lead to greater investigation, which may then lead to action against a specific potential high-level offender who is at the moment a low-level offender, whatever that category is?
We've been really clear in terms of our commitment to attending incidents when they're reported, so attending the scene, speaking to witnesses and victims, and encouraging and supporting our officers to be professionally curious. But we're also, as you've said, there is a reality. Maggie mentioned at the outset the scale of offending. I mentioned, just rape alone, an increase of 244% in reporting to police. But other, domestic abuse now, it's more than 11% of emergency calls into policing, more than 30% of violence with injury reported to police, more than 50% of violence experienced by women in London is domestic abuse. And therefore, and we also know from Operation Soteria the impact upon our investigators of repeated exposure to these traumatic cases. All of that adds up to a difficult leadership challenge for us in policing, but we are really determined about prioritisation. We are working with every call handler in the Met is trained to apply a threat, harm, risk, investigative vulnerability assessment at the point of call, and the Inspectorate of Constabulary assess how well we're doing that when they inspect our effectiveness, so that we seek to identify those cases that, the difference between confused person left their home not properly dressed, someone reports it to us, as opposed to somebody committing an aggressive offence of indecent exposure in public, and us identifying the risk associated with that, applying the right resources and seeking to join the dots between offending.
Can you explain how the V100 initiative works? I mean, it's overseen by the Met's chief scientific officer and utilises supposedly data analytics to identify and target, in this case, the 100 men who pose the most risk to women. How big a difference is it actually making? Because that requires quite a lot of analytics and people trained and able to do that sort of analytics and identify somebody or individuals who have the potential to become serious sexual offenders rather than less serious but still offenders all the same, and yet it hasn't been a priority for the police in the past, to the extent that a lot of women don't report it because it will almost be laughed off. Oh, you know, it's old such and such, he always does that on a sort of full moon or whatever, just to be, you know, flippant about it. Are the police really taking this seriously now, and what changed?
Yes. I think the events of the last few years, but I've worked as a national lead for domestic abuse since 2013, 10 years. I've seen a lot of change in that time. I've seen greater investment in our understanding of the risk inherent in violence against women and girls. You know, sadly, 2 women a week die in the UK at the hands of a partner or ex-partner through domestic abuse alone.
Can I stop you there? I entirely understand that, and domestic violence is a huge problem, and it's taken much more seriously. This is a bit different because these are usually strangers exposing themselves to completely random and unknown victims, mostly women, harder to identify. Unlike domestic violence, we know who's doing it. It's a question of whether the victim is brave enough to come forward and shop the known partner or whoever it is. So this is a different... I'm not interested in this scenario about domestic violence. It's completely separate.
Of course, I understand, although we do see a huge overlap in offending. So whilst we say much happens within the home, actually we do see that predatory perpetrators will offend against many victims, sadly, in the home and outside. Ben Russell is leading the work on the V100, so he's the best person to describe it, but from my perspective, a really effective tool that we are determined to exploit and make the most of.
Baton has been passed.
Yeah, that's fine. No problem. So there's probably 2 different problem sets, actually, and I just want to be clear to differentiate between the 2. So we have a problem with a disproportionate amount of harm against women being caused by a relatively small cohort of offenders. And the theory behind the V100 is you target the small cohort of offenders, you prevent and stop a disproportionate amount of harm. That's slightly separate, I think, to the problem that you've spoken about, which is about escalatory behaviour, where something might start, as you describe, and end up in very serious contact offending. What we want to do is develop a kind of an algorithm type approach to build that. We're not there yet. So you talked about Professor Sherman, our Strategic Insights Unit are working on a kind of algorithmic, more complex approach that would try and take all the data, because the challenge of London is volume. The benefit of that is you have a lot of data. To try to build something that says, well, actually early on, could we spot the people that we think are on that pattern? But we're not there yet. We're working closely with Maggie's team. We've got a bit more to do. What we do with the V100 at the moment is we take the named suspects. So you have to know the name. You have to know the name. You can't have an offender focus if you don't know the name of the offender. So this is we've got about 33,000 named suspects of org offences in the last year alone in London. We take all those 33,000 and we say, how are we going to adopt a triage process where we focus on the ones we think are causing the most harm? So we look at recency of their offending. Is it in the last year? Severity. How serious are they named as a suspect on that offending? And then frequency. And partly because of the challenges we've heard about the criminal justice system, this is about suspects. So we're focusing on people who are named for suspicion. And then we chuck a load of resource at it, as much as we can find, really. If you're investigating a murder, you'd have a detective chief inspector leading that investigation, and it's the same for one of these cases. So our approach is, yes, if we can prosecute, we will. If we can prosecute for anything, we will. So a significant number of these people are also involved in other crime. So we will give the same. If you're on our top 100 stack, we will investigate you for whatever you're involved in.
So this 33,000 will include people who've never actually been charged or prosecuted, but have been reported.
Yes, exactly.
As likely to have
exactly. So this is not the police. This is the vast majority of this data comes from what the public are telling us.
Yeah.
So we join the dots. We pull those cases together. We see quite a lot of our people at the top of our stack are offending against multiple victims, different parts of London. There's potentially many, many years of historic information about these people. There's often complex mental health needs. You have addiction challenges. They are really complex and challenging cases. So for us, the approach is use the data to spot the people we think are behind the most harm and throw everything we can at them.
Thank you.
I'll listen to you, Liz.
Thank you, Chair. I've got some questions for ECC Paul Furnell, because British Transport Police obviously have operations in Scotland as well. I'm quite curious, I suppose, in the first instance. I saw that you had the Railway Guardian app, that you've been working with Crime Stoppers on that. So if you could tell us, first of all, how successful that has been, how many reports have you had, how many convictions have led from that?
I'll have to come back to you on reports at a later date, but certainly the Railway Guardian app, again, going back to the 2019 research that we heard from survivors, was a speed and access to reporting to allow the anonymous and confidential intelligence in reporting that we were seeking. So the simplest way for us was to develop an application that was national, that reaches across 3 countries for British Transport Police, and the Railway Guardian app's now been up and running for a couple of years. We have over 300,000 users of the app at the moment. You can traditionally report, as you would report on Single Online Home, to a Home Office force, to British Transport Police that way. You can report intelligence information. Equally, and important for us, the transient population that we are dealing with, both offender-based and victim-based, it's important that we get the access to that information fast time. So within there, you'll be alive to 61016, the tech service for British Transport Police. I think it's a unique service in policing. It goes live time into a control room, and we deploy resources as soon as we get that call, as if you were ringing the police. That's being built into the app. So as soon as someone, whether that's a bystander, a victim of offence, texts us or reports via the app, then we will deploy resources to that train, that location, next station, to deal with the information on description or location of where the reporting is. We also use the application to push and pull a lot of information and data around information sharing, around non-contact. We've done a lot of campaign material around describing what sexual harassment is, because we've been talking around some of the sort of high harm offenders. But the volume-based offender for us, we've had to sort of also tackle the threshold of reporting, because I think that's been lost over many years of perhaps, will the police take this seriously? Will we report? Should we report? And therefore it hasn't been reported. And we've spent many years asking the public through the campaigns to report every single bit of information. For us, it paints a picture. And coming back to Ben's point around, we only can actually target and proactively target offenders if we can identify who they are and where they're operating. I suspect it won't be a standalone offence. So the app's been very successful, still quite early stages. We're having quite a lot of dialogue with Maggie and the National Vorg work and with the Police Digital Service to try and tie that into Home Office forces. Because, of course, we don't have a resident population. So every offender for us, every victim for us, is a resident of a Home Office force area. So the key intelligence sharing to identify risk from British Transport Police into our Home Office to manage that offender is critical. And definitely where the national work is really helping us with that is that consistency of operation, because we operate through all 43 forces, so we have to have a consistent approach to our offender management and our service to victims.
I think it'd be useful for the committee to get some of the stats on, yes, you've got 300,000 people that are using the app. How regularly are they using the app? Have they downloaded it and never used it, never looked at it? And how many how the recording of that works as well. How does that work as a follow-up? So if I reported something, I'm sure, in common with many women, when we've been on public transport and an airdrop pops up on your phone, if I were to report that to you, what would then happen?
Well, one of the benefits, the app's on about its 4th version, so we're always adding. One of the things that we were really keen to do when we developed the app was buying into a relationship for it to evolve. So the ability to upload images from your phone that have been sent to you, whether that's airdropping you mentioned, that's quite a prolific offending on the rail transport infrastructure. So you can share that. You can also capture video and audio on the app as it's happening and come straight through to us. You will get a reply via 61016 via the text message from our controller letting you know what's happening. One of the benefits also from a safety perspective is if the perpetrator's nearby, you're not picking up the phone and making a call to the police, so the perpetrator knows you're doing that. So again, encouraging through the app bystander information, bystander advice. We'll have all sat on a train and seen behaviour that we're not comfortable with. And apologies, we added an I to VAWG, so for us it's VIAWG, because we definitely talk about intimidation. And behaviour on the train that might escalate around that. So that's something that we concentrate heavily on in responding, in dialogue with the person on the end of the phone or the end of the application. We are very keen with the provider to look at the data. You're right, we need to understand how many people are using rather than just downloading. We've all got apps on our phones that we never use. So it's really key for us to make sure that we're capturing the use of that. I can only say that the fact that we've doubled our report around non-contact offending and doubled our report around sexual assault offending, that something in our campaign through app or text is having an impact around confidence in reporting, but I still think it's the tip of the iceberg.
I mean, saying doubled, it could go from 2 to 4, that's doubling, but it's still very low.
Yes.
And I had a look to see if I could find any stats on this for Scotland particularly, and there was an FOI to British Transport Police in Scotland that said between 2019 and 2023 there was only 3 offences recorded. That's nothing.
No.
Compared to the scale of this, is it?
No, absolutely.
If a third of women are being sexually harassed on their commute, 3 reports over 4 years is nothing.
No, I'll check the data and write and confirm those figures that you have, but certainly we are seeing an increase across the UK. I'll have a look at the Scotland figures and write it into the committee.
Thanks. And finally, in a sort of technical aspect, I suppose, on how you operate with that. So if I am on the West Coast Main Line and I receive an airdrop in Penrith, how is that recorded? Will that be, and will somebody be there in Glasgow? And how does that work with the different legislation in Scotland and in England?
Yeah, we will try and define exactly where the offence took place. Obviously, you might be travelling at quite a speed through different jurisdictions, so that's something historically in British Transport Police we've had to try and really work hard on, because we ended up with recording end of route. Yeah. And of course, from an analytical perspective, that's not.
So everything's happening in Glasgow, doesn't it?
Exactly. So if you look at our data, you'll often see the major hubs around the country as being historically the place. So we've done a lot of work through our reporting mechanism to try and identify and geolocate exactly where that might happen. Okay. Technology can assist us with that, with the permission of the victim and survivor, and then we will obviously record the offence where it took place, wherever that jurisdiction, and then respond in that way.
There has been a sort of an offence, it's not quite called cyber flashing, it's under the Sexual Offences Scotland Act since 2010, 2010 in Scotland for that kind of offence.
I'm attending Scotland in a couple of months' time to look at where the slight differences in legislation. For me, it doesn't change our definition of what we look through. I think it's just then the technical recording and prosecution around those offences, because we very much are concentrating on sexual harassment is the same in England, Scotland and Wales. As far as I'm concerned, the technology and sort of the detail around the prosecution is slightly different.
Okay, thank you. Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair. And ACC Furnell, I'd just like to follow up a few questions there, if I may. Travelling on the tube and mainline rail, can't help but notice the sheer number of adverts that are up now at the moment explaining what the bounds of acceptability are and where to go if people are straying beyond that. I know you've covered some of this with the conversation about the app, but I just wonder what the impact is for you on that sort of increased visibility on public transport in terms of reports made to you, but also the demands on your resourcing as well.
I mean, we're heavily behind those. They're in joint campaigns with the rail operators, with TfL, etc., across the country. We're massively supportive. I think from the outset in 2019, I said to Lucy Dorsey, our Chief Constable, that success for us initially is going to be a significant increase in reporting, and we are not there yet. So I do expect that short-term success is going to see a significant increase in demand for policing. So yes, it has increased our demand. We have never had, we're at the highest reporting through 61016 that we've ever had as an organisation, and we're preparing ourselves for further increases. Section 4B goes live this year, so around the Public Order Act, the sort of dedicated offence around sexual harassment, that will redefine the data picture for all police forces, including us, albeit that we already capture that. And I also think that the messaging that you've seen, which I'm glad you've seen, has been about sort of challenging society, and in particular men, to what sexual harassment is. And I mentioned earlier the RISE programme. We've put some offenders through a RISE programme, and their feedback of those that have gone through that programme is awareness and education around language, misogynistic behaviour, and assisting in trying to get to where Ben is, in where we look at and can identify as a policing organisation the offenders we need to target through prosecution versus education and behaviour. And likewise, I think the Workers' Protection Bill later this year in October for employers around sexual harassment and non-contact sexual offending will increase reporting to policing. So I think all of those things will add up to demand going up for UK policing, full stop.
You'd expect to see, thank you for that, you'd expect to see an increase in reporting. I'm just wondering if you've managed to capture any sort of deterrent effect from that increase in advertising as well.
Difficult to measure the impact of some of the campaign directly. Certainly through the very small numbers, because it's early days, that we've put through the behaviour programme, there's been reference to that learning and awareness. I've had direct contact from members of the public around particular posters. You may have seen the one around staring, and there's definitely two forms of staring. One's not an offence, and one can very much be an offence around the intimidation. And so there's been quite a lot of dialogue directly with me and my team around trying to explain that, I mean, in particular from men. And we have a male ally function within BTP, a group of men that are there to assist in explaining what that definition is and the difference between an offence and a non-offence.
And do you have a rough statistic for how much of your work as BTP actually is dealing in this area, as opposed to other types of crime?
We definitely will have that data, and I'll be able to share that with you in writing.
Appreciate that. Thank you. And then just a couple of nuts and bolts questions, if you don't mind. So we talked about whether you report direct to you, whether you report to the force in your local area. How's that collated? Just in terms of making sure that you know where that offence has taken place, who leads on investigations, that sort of.
If the offence has taken place on the rail infrastructure, on BTP jurisdiction, we will deal with that offending. We have specially trained officers. We have a RASO function within British Transport. We mirror everything that Home Office force would have in our capability and capacity to deal. So we would deal with that investigation. The critical bit for me is the longer term offender management. We are not obliged by legislation to have a visor function, but 3 years ago we created a dedicated sexual offending management structure within the force, because we identified that we do have sexual perpetrators who will use the railway to offend. It is very much their MO, and so it's critical for us to have an offender management function wrapped around those individuals. But our offender managers will therefore be obliged to liaise with Home Office colleagues within their visor functions to make sure the management of that offender is very tight and joint. And we will deal with both, transport to and from prison releases, etc. If the intelligence cases are there, we will deal with offenders who are travelling using the rail infrastructure and support Home Office forces in the management of that offender. But we will deal with those investigations.
And so if I were to make a report to you as a victim of a non-contact sexual offence, would I be then put through to a specialist officer, or would it be a more generalist?
Depending on the offence, if it was a RASO offence, it would go into our major serious and organised crime. So again, as Maggie mentioned earlier, all forces are structured slightly differently in that context. For us, all of our RASO are dealt with by our major serious and organised crime team, so a dedicated team if it's a RASO offence. Any sexual offence is managed by our CID, so it would definitely be a detective. Again, that's around demand and capacity. I know that Home Office forces, that would not necessarily be the case for those offences, but in BTP, as it stands at the moment, all offences would be dealt with by a trained detective.
Thank you. And then just last one for me, Chair, just back to Mr Lawton's point around trying to identify these sort of individual acts. It's obviously harder for you because your network spans 3 countries. So how does that work for you when you might have an offender who gets on a train at London Euston and ends up in Penrith or wherever? We're picking on Penrith today. I'm sure there's nothing wrong with the good people of Penrith.
We are a data-rich environment, as you'll all be alive to on the transport infrastructure. We have a dedicated, centralised intelligence function. So all of that offending will go through a central intelligence function that links into local intelligence. We developed 6 years ago a Streamline system. It's called Streamline. Basically, that technology is an image comparison tool. So again, irrespective of whether the victim or survivor has reported and wishes to pursue the investigation or whether it's anonymous, the data-rich environment will allow us to collect the image-based, the footprint that might be left through other data such as Oyster or anything else, tapping in, tapping out of the infrastructure, financial payment, etc. So we can track and trace offender and look at pattern of behaviour, use our image-based capability to identify if we think there's a link, and then that might be a travelling offender or it may be an offender who's operating in a certain jurisdiction. Obviously, in London, that offender may be in and out very short stops across the infrastructure, long distance, more rural areas. Then you tend to see the offender might be moving slightly more, but we are able to capture that through a central intelligence mechanism. Thank you very much.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, witnesses, for coming. Much appreciated. Our population in the UK is changing dramatically over the years, and culturally there have been some changes as well. And I don't want to single out anybody, any group in particular, but we know there are some groups of women from different cultures that are treated differently. They're scared to speak out. There may be a language problem and things like that. And I'm sure there is problems in these communities where they don't get the support that they deserve. How do you reach out to these people? Maggie. Well,
probably one for me. We absolutely accept that there are such varied communities across the country, and therefore the national coordination that we do is important, but there's also got to be that local response and local forces engaging with their communities to ensure that there is a confidence to report in. And the way that that's being done at the moment really varies, if I'm honest, across the country, but use of advisory groups at local level to try and bring in women from some communities who may traditionally not have reported. For example, I know that there's some women who are deaf and find it difficult to report in, and so the deaf community have made clear representations into policing around that. There are other communities who may be linked to asylum-seeking communities who find it difficult to report in and are not confident to do so. So there's a lot of work that we have to do at local level to increase that confidence to report. So it's a very valid point and one that we're very mindful of.
Thank you. That's it, Chair.
Thank you. I just wanted to check. I know with BTP you can report anonymously. Can you report anonymously to other police forces? I'm just wondering, do you always have to give your name if you want to report in, say, a non-contact sexual offence that's been committed?
Shall I answer that one? Yeah. So I know certainly we're looking at anonymous reporting in terms of our own people being able to report in. In terms of reporting anything in, anyone can use, for example, Single Online Home to provide an intelligence report that doesn't necessarily have to have a name. The challenge is following that up, I suppose, without a name and any identity. So the more information we can get from somebody. We also encourage third-party reporting. So if somebody doesn't feel confident to come in themselves, then they can rely on another person to report that in. That's quite powerful, we hear. But the more, I think we've got to encourage women in particular to feel confident to report into us. And I know that there's so much work going on in forces to encourage that trust to increase, because otherwise we've only ever got partial part of the picture.
I I think we've heard some evidence that actually having that ability to report anonymously would be very helpful.
Yeah.
You're saying if you do it anonymously, it's likely not to be treated with the same...
I think it will be treated as intelligence. That's really important. It's just hard to follow up, and we already know that evidence gathering is challenging in some of the complex areas we have. The more information we can get about somebody being affected, the more obvious it can go forward through to a
Can
charge.
I just also ask you about part 1 of the Angelini report, which called on the College of Policing and National Police Chiefs Council to improve guidance and training on indecent exposure by December this year. Is that underway? How far have you got?
Very much underway, and I think it's important to also reiterate the research bit. We recognise there is a paucity of research. We've got a literature review that we're just completing for this summer, and we're enhancing we want to enhance the training as part of how we deal with RASO generally. So we are we've already updated our approved professional practice in terms of indecent exposure, but we also want to include that in the training and the approach towards Soteria. So not something separate, but to bring it around the evidence base of Soteria.
You'll get that done by December.
Absolutely.
Okay. And the other point from part 1 was around a specialist policy for all sexual offences, including indecent exposure in all police forces.
Yes, we want to do that centrally again, and it's the importance of central coordination to ensure consistency rather than all 43 forces developing their own.
Right.
Through Soteria, we're taking that forward in a national way.
Right, okay. And just very finally, we've been very concerned about workforce on this committee within policing. We know there's been the Uplift programme, but in terms of the analytical capability that it sounds like you all need and rely on in order to be able to see what data's showing you, have you got that? Have you got the data analytics that you need? Perhaps Commander Russell.
So the intelligence. So I've got the intelligence analysis capability in the Met. So part of the focus, obviously, in police officer numbers we've seen in recent years has been somewhat at the expense of police staff. So our data analytics colleagues are often police staff. So there's a challenge around kind of it's not. We shouldn't just focus on officer numbers. Firstly, there's a recruitment challenge. Lots of people. If you're a data analytically minded intelligence analyst living and working in London, you've got lots of places you could work. I think part of the attraction in law enforcement is about the mission and about the opportunities to be involved in some of the things we talked about today. Every part of London has a dedicated VORG analyst, but it is challenging. What part of our experience is people are excited to work for the police, we recruit them, we train them, they get really good, and then they go work somewhere else.
Thank you very much for your evidence today. That's been very helpful as part of our inquiry. And we certainly look forward to the developments that we'll hopefully see in policing over the next few months and years to focus on this particular area that we are interested in around non-contact sexual offending. So thank you again. Thank you. So we'll move to our second panel. And I'm going to come to you.
I was going to say come to me later because...
Okay.
You're going, yeah. Okay.
It's here, right?
Embarrassing if she isn't.
Especially when we kept her waiting. Yes, she's here. Yeah. Apologies for keeping you waiting. It's very nice to see you, Minister, back before the committee in a slightly different role to the one when you used to be a member of the committee, but we're very pleased to see you today. I guess, would you like to just introduce yourself and the officials who are with you to the committee?
Yes, it's good to be back at Home Affairs.
I'm Laura Farris, and I'm the Minister for Safeguarding and for Victims. And with me is Amy Randall, who is from the MOJ, and Joanna West from the Home Office, and collectively they're the two most senior civil servants who support my work, which has direct cut across the MOJ and the Home Office.
Right. Well, you're all very welcome. I would just like to start off by asking you, Minister, we've been particularly concerned with non-contact sexual offending and whether there's an appropriate response from the police, whether policies are in place to try and deal with this. I wondered perhaps if you could just set out where non-contact sexual offending fits in the violence against women and girls strategy, and particularly around the prevention and the attempt to stop offending escalating. Perhaps you could just set out where you think we are at the moment on this.
Well, I think it's a very worthwhile inquiry, and one of the reasons why I think it's worthwhile is that non-contact sexual offending falls outside the sort of RASO specialism, the rape and serious sexual offences specialism, and it also falls outside the domestic abuse specialism, although there is one exception to that, stalking, which has not exclusive but some overlap with domestic abuse. And I think that that obviously means that it falls into the high volume and I think historically has been seen as sometimes low harm offending. And I also think that one of the things that came out of the Angelini report was that it, and I will comment a little bit more on this, is that sometimes it hadn't been treated with the seriousness it deserved by officers. Although I want to be very clear on that. When you look at the three most important prelude offences to Wayne Couzens offending, there was the 2015 incident, there was the McDonald's drive-through incident in 2021, and there was the incident in the Lane in Kent in November 2020, all indecent exposure, and in one case, masturbatory indecent exposure. In all of those cases, the IOPC found fault with the officers who handled it. And for example, in the 2021 incident, the failure to record the CCTV and to use the credit card would have amounted to gross misconduct of that officer. So irrespective of what I'm going to come on to say about the police, I think it is worth saying that some of those officers fell below the standard that would ordinarily have been expected by a reasonably competent officer acting with those facts at that time and that level of training. So that's one thing. The good thing, I think, on this is that Parliament and the Home Office and the police has developed thinking on non-contact offending. So prior to the implementation of the Sex Offences Act 2003, flashing was seen as public nuisance. Following the passage of that act, it was treated as a sexual offence. Also, stalking, which was initially kind of lumped together with harassment under the Protection from Harassment Act 1997. In the life of this government in 2012, amendments were made to that to create a freestanding offence. In 2017, we went on to double the maximum sentence from 5 years to 10 years. So I think Parliament had begun to shine a spotlight and identify a more serious category of offending that related to non-contact offences. And I think stalking in particular actually has had an improved response. And the other thing, I think, is that we have moved away from some of the infantilising language, which I think suggested that these incidents should be downplayed. I think flashing is an unhelpful term. I'm sorry that I used it in my response. But upskirting, downblousing, all of this suggests something sort of light and fluffy, something silly that might happen, rather than what is in fact a grossly invasive, degrading experience for a woman that is, and it is nearly always a woman, that either directly goes to their personal sort of safety or exposes them to something which is akin to violence, although non-contact. So on that, where I think there is an important piece of work to do is with the College of Policing, and where we've seen the most improvement in the College of Policing's work is where they've been supported by academics. So West, the Operation Soteria academics supported them in delivering the specialist rape training that now nearly 3,000 officers have had in England and Wales. That's led to an effective training programme. So I don't mean this critically, but it's not the College of Policing acting on their own. They're guided. And equally with the Domestic Abuse Matters training, that's supported by Safe Lives and Women's Aid. So experts are framing the design of that. Now, the College of Policing, the MPCC, the Home Office have got tasks to do following publication of the Angelini report, phase 1. We've accepted that. But I think in designing the non-contact offence guidance, and she is very critical of what the 2016 guidance says, I do think that we should have input from academics and experts in how the College of Policing approach that. And I think the deficiencies in the 2016 version show that perhaps doing it on their own did not sufficiently capture that. That was a comprehensive
That's very
answer.
helpful. No, I think that's set very clearly. That's very helpful indeed. I'm going to come to Simon Fell, but just before I do, I just wanted to ask you, is your view that non-contact sexual offending should sit within the specialist units within police forces that deal with rape and sexual offending, just so they can identify early on those patterns of behaviour which might be, they might then be able to bring perpetrators to account, rather than it being dealt with by the volume CID offending approach?
I think my preliminary view is yes to that. And I think that is augmented by the fact that we've added violence against women to the strategic policing requirement, which basically makes violence against women a priority when resources are allocated. And we have designated leads like Louisa, Rolfe, Maggie, Blyth. And I think it probably undermines the effort on this if it is treated in a separate way. And I think we've already got quite close to recognising that stalking very often belongs within that package of offences. So I'm probably speaking prematurely because I haven't got the kind of clearance, but I do think actually it belongs within the same framework. Yes, I do.
And just for very finally, before I come to Simon, RASOs are not in every police force, and we've questioned the witnesses on the first panel about why that is. We're told that some smaller police forces, it's around resourcing and they're not able to do that. But that seems to me a rather, if you're subject to a serious sexual assault or a rape in one of the smaller police forces, you'd still want to have the expertise and the level of skill in the officers investigating. So I just wondered, is your view is that a reasonable excuse not to have specialist units?
So with the specialist rape training, we set a target of 2,000 officers. So these are the frontline officers that they would be in place by April, and we've more than exceeded that target. So there's 2,840, I think, and they are across all 43 forces, even the smaller ones. I want to make clear that I think that training is, only the first part of it. But it is true to say that there isn't a force that doesn't have anyone who's had specialist rape training. And yes, I think Soteria is the template for this, because we can now say 3 years after we implemented the Rape Review Action Plan, it has had a transformative effect on policing. If you look at some forces, some of the Pathfinder forces like the Met, and you look at the volume of cases that they were sending to the CPS for a charging decision, they have more than quadrupled the volume of cases they're sending. That shows how much that Soteria model has affected how they're handling that. So I think, is there room for specialism? Yes, Soteria in a sense is a form of specialism, and there are now trained officers in every force.
Right, okay. And
that doesn't mean that's the end of the answer, though, to respond respectfully. Actually, I do think that, of course, specialism and training, we are seeing its value. It has basically been the story of the last 3 years. And so, I hope this is iterative and you'll see more of that.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll be coming on to levels of referrals to the CPS. Simon Fell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, panel, for joining us, and good to see you, Minister. I'd like to ask a few questions around online non-contact sexual offences, especially with regards to young people and the effect on them. Certainly the evidence we've heard in previous sessions, when I go out and talk to schools in my constituency, is that this feels almost like an ungoverned space. It is causing a huge amount of difficulty for young people. So I'd be interested, just as a starter, to understand what your engagement has been like with tech firms around this, to try and change some of the behaviour that goes on there and better protect some of the young people who are affected by this.
So you're quite right to raise the online environment. The Susie Lamplugh Trust has, staggering statistics on the amount of stalking that takes place online, just to give you one example. And I think it goes into another point. When you're looking at the factors that contribute to violence against women, yes, non-contact offences and whether they escalate is definitely an element of that. The ubiquity of online porn, violent online porn, is a major, major issue. And actually, one of the limiting factors at the Home Office is that we're always at the end of the road trying to deal with, well, prevention, yes, but also how we deal with stalking, how we deal with intimate image abuse. But actually, I think there's still a pipeline of young men coming through who are able to access at the click of their phone content that has an unbelievably damaging effect on their attitude towards women and their proclivities, their sexual proclivities. And I think it places young women in a very dangerous position. So if I could talk about the online environment briefly, well, look, you will know about the Online Safety Act and what that says about things like revenge porn, intimate image abuse, taking and sharing, and we're equalising that in the criminal justice bill. But if I could go a bit further than that, one of the most important things I think is happening in Parliament at the moment is Baroness Burton's pornography review. And I hope, I'll be absolutely clear, I hope that will lead to clear proposals in the manifestos of all the parties about what we say about this. Because we cannot ignore, if you look at some of the most horrific cases, which all of you will be familiar with, whether it's Sophie Moss or Megan Newborough or Sarah Everard, what do they have in common? That those perpetrators, those killers, had an appetite for violent online pornography. Now, we can't directly prove causation, but we can say that it's there in every single one of these cases, and I'm very, very interested in what happens in the pornography review. I've had this conversation with Baroness Burton. I also want to say a little bit about pseudo-images and deepfakes, because you will, I hope, have spotted the government Home Office's announcement last week about banning the creation of deepfakes, and that was quite a difficult decision to make because the Law Commission had recommended that we didn't do that because of the risk of criminalising children. But we're creating a straightforward creating offence. You'll get a criminal record if you sit on an app and make a nude image using AI with a real person's face. And as a result of that, the two of the biggest deepfake companies in the world, one of them is certainly big, and the other's a Nudify company that's based in Spain, have blocked access to users from the United Kingdom overnight, even though the bill hasn't hit the statute book. And so it's a sign, actually, that if you act strongly and you make your legislation and your intentions clear, and we are the first national government, by the way, to ban the creation of sexually explicit deepfakes, that you can actually have a very quick and direct effect. So I'm very interested in this. I'm feeling quite emboldened, actually, by last week's announcement. And I'm very hopeful, actually, we will see some progress from that, from the pornography review in the future. I think it's really important.
We will come on to deep fakes
sorry,
in a little bit.
Jump the gun.
I don't want to eat Tim's sandwiches. But I'm interested in this. So I'm glad you're having that engagement, and I'm glad you're seeing those signals working through the system. But in our last session, we heard criticism of the regulator and whether they're going far enough in this regard. What's your engagement with the regulator like, and pushing them to better enforce what some of these companies are doing?
So I have to say I have not had any engagement with Ofcom, but the concern actually that they're not going far enough has been raised with me in the course of the last few weeks. So that is now a priority for me, because the Online Safety Act, has an iterative introduction. That was permitted and that was seen as desirable when the Act was going through the House. But we're waiting quite a long time for it to protect children, and it's not going to be worth all that effort if we get there and find that it hasn't done the job. And obviously there were always a number of concerns about whether it would have sufficiently stringent protection for children online. And so if they're given this allowance of time to develop these whatever they're called codes of practice or guidance stuff, the Ofcom codes of practice, these have got to be very robust. We're expecting that.
Thank you. And you talked about the pipeline of young men.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right too. This is deeply concerning.
Yeah.
When I talk to online firms, especially social media companies who are predominantly skewed towards young people, their concern is very much around this exploitation piece and what has become normalised through access to pornography, and then is used in anger against some of the young people who have taken this imagery, shared this imagery on their platforms. I'm not going to ask you to announce policy on the hoof around banning mobile phones or anything like that, but there is a way to cut off that pipeline, which is about moving far more to the prevention space rather than cure. And I'd just be really interested in your thoughts there around whether the government is doing enough on education and awareness and trying to get young people into the space where they can better protect themselves from this stuff.
I think that's an excellent question. Let me just start with just going back to what the Law Commission, and again why they had recommended that we didn't create a creation offence. They were worried about us criminalising teenage boys, but I think you could say that something has already gone quite wrong in society, where you've got an issue where 16-year-old or 15-year-old boys are going to find themselves with a criminal record because you must have allowed things to exist in their world for that to happen. It's true that there are things that are in the ether. They get raised in the house. They're not part of government policy. But the idea of banning under 16-year-olds from using social media, and we know, by the way, that some of the most common sites that we all use as MPs do host really, really explicit, sometimes violent content that's again freely available. Banning phones. We don't know what Baroness Burton could say, but she could recommend something very stringent on porn. Now that is one set of options, and I think it would be fair to say that everybody is thinking carefully about whether or not that is achievable. I think you're right to mention education. I was reading the Tackling Violence Against Women strategy, the document that was produced by the Home Office in the immediate aftermath of Sarah Everard's case. And one of the things I think is really striking is how much of that has been implemented and has been successful. And I think one of the biggest flanks where I think you could say it hasn't really been successful is in education. So there has been the RHSE work, and I don't think that goes far enough. And two things I'd like to see. I think we need to start the education process at primary school, and I believe it's really secondary school focused. And I think we need to prepare children a lot more for what they encounter, including sort of influences and attitudes that they'll be exposed to, and people who will try and take their thinking in a certain way. And I was reading a critical piece about education was saying you can't really expect a 60-year-old teacher to compete with a social influencer who has like 20 million followers. And I do accept that point, but I still think that there is something between the ages of maybe 8, 9 and about 12, 13 that is a critical point where we could reach children, and I don't think that's there yet. We are talking about that in the Home Office, but that is definitely where I'd like to see a focus on education and RHSE. And I've been actually into schools and observed some RHSE. I went to one in London recently, and I thought the quality of teaching was very good, but the children were quite old. They were 13, 14. They're beginning already to have developed, they may have had a sexual experience by that age. They're already viewing the opposite sex in a certain way, the way that they wouldn't be when they're younger. So I still think there's an opportunity with younger children that we haven't explored enough yet.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much.
Can I just check, because the Home Office's annual report and account states that 35% of commitments have been met across the VROG strategy and domestic abuse action plan, but it doesn't break it down individually. So are you able to say in relation to the non-contact sexual offending, what's actually been achieved?
Sorry, I can't give you an itemised answer.
Can you write to us with that information? That would be helpful.
I can, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel.
Good morning.
Minister, the government accepted a number of the Angelini recommendations, and one of them was the masturbatory exposure, but that was also identified in the 2021 VROG strategy. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about why it hasn't already been undertaken.
So look, one of the things that we're going to the second part of the Angelini report is going to go much more into the just general quality of policing. I mean, one of the things that she does leave open in relation to masturbatory and indecent exposure is that there's a kind of, I have to say, I'm just quoting her report, that there's a police lethargy when it comes to policing what are perceived to be low-level crimes. And she does point out that actually one of the incidents that did result in a reference to the IOPC was in 2015, before the College of Policing had updated its guidance. I don't think that since the Tackling Violence Against Women strategy was published, we've seen any evidence that something like masturbatory indecent exposure isn't treated seriously, that leads aren't followed up, and that there hasn't been some improvement. But as I said, I do think the critical part of that, and this is a joint piece of work between the College of Police and the MPCC and the Home Office, is updating the guidance for for the frontline police officer to work on that, to respond adequately. Because, what she says about the police who were confronted with, there were three really important gateway incidents before Wayne Couzens attacked Sarah Everard. And all three of them were mishandled because the police didn't perform their duties to the adequate standard. And in all three of them, actually, the victim had provided very good evidence, number plates. With the McDonald's one, they'd provided the digits of his credit card because, very unusually, he'd used his standard card to pay as well as exposing himself. And the reason actually why that officer who left before the IOPC had concluded would have been found guilty of gross misconduct is that she misled her force and said that the CCTV had already been deleted and it hadn't, and if she'd bothered to look at that it would have given a positive identification of him as well. So there are a number of, that was a basic functional failure, not a failure of the fact that indecent masturbatory exposure is serious. And stalking is also serious. We know that has a link to escalating behaviour.
Thanks, Minister. Could you say a little bit about how you're working with the Minister for Policing in terms of Angelini, particularly in reference to non-sexual contact offences?
I think probably the most direct kind of work I've done with the Minister for Policing has been about the quality of police officers and vetting. And I just wanted to kind of, I suppose, sorry, I know that's not exactly the question, but I'll just answer that one if I may. I think if we had a sort of limitless period of time, there is a big question about whether or not the fact that police law is distinct from standard employment law is appropriate any longer, because there is a sort of more complex system of dismissal for police officers than would exist if you just worked in an ordinary workplace down the road. And I think that sensible changes that we're making, so for example, the decision to dismiss an officer had to be taken by an independent lawyer rather than a chief officer who would have the closest day-to-day knowledge of that officer, has resulted in circumstances where in some forces they know that a person is manifestly inappropriate to continue as an officer, but they have succeeded in a disciplinary panel, they've been exonerated, and they haven't been able to sack them. So we're changing that from the 7th of May. A chief officer will be leading the disciplinary panel and can take the decision. We're also making it easier for them to be dismissed after a re-vetting period, because of re-vetting process, because actually that, even though we could do re-vetting, it was difficult to dismiss as an immediate consequence of that, and that's changing this side of the summer. I had a conversation with the policing minister yesterday about when that change would be coming in. And also in the criminal justice bill, that if a chief officer is still unhappy for whatever reason with somebody, that they can automatically appeal a decision, a historic decision not to dismiss. And when I spoke to Mark Rowley last week, he told me that when it comes to officers coming in, they're failing twice as many as they were before, and they're dismissing twice as many as they were before. I know that doesn't give you total confidence, but to show that quite a substantial change in the way that conducting the Met Police certainly has resulted from what's come about in relation to that.
I think we heard in the earlier panel that there is, a level of inconsistency across the 43 forces as well, and so I think that probably needs to be looked at. But just in terms of being the Minister for Victims and Safeguarding, I'd be interested to hear from you how you would describe the support available to victims of non-sexual contact offences.
Well, we have. Can I just go back to the first bit of what you're talking about, inconsistency? So I think that is probably the biggest challenge for a minister in the Home Office in this area of the law, that all 43 forces have operational independence. And that's why I think things like the specialist rape training, the specialist domestic abuse matters training are probably the most powerful tool we have to ensure there is some consistency. And I think that there's an opportunity to have an equivalent training in non-contact offences, and I would include stalking in that because we cannot ignore it as a very, very significant gateway issue. And the other thing is, I think there is an opportunity to take soteria and apply it more widely to other forms of violence against women, because it has been so effective in the police handling of rape that I think that it wouldn't read across perfectly into all other forms of offending. but I do think that it would be very, very significant if it worked. In terms of support, well, we reserve our principal support independent sexual violence advisors for victims of RASO offences. So you have, in the last 14 years, I think we've quadrupled the amount we spend on victim services, but one of the things we're proudest of are the now nearly 1,000 independent sexual violence advisors who will support a RASO victim through every stage of the criminal justice system. But we don't have an equivalent in place for a victim of a non-contact offence. However, I do work with the Susie Lamplugh Trust. And one of the things that we've been talking about, there are 3 things we've been talking about: a stalking strategy, a specific stalking strategy. Looking again at the definition of stalking, it is now quite out of date. It's 12 years old, and it's heavily influenced by the 1997 environment, which it sort of fits into. In fact, one of the issues that we often find with policing is that they classify stalking as harassment. And when you look at the 1997 Act, where the provisions apply, that's because the Act describes harassment as one example of stalking. So we kind of muddle the police up by using one word, one crime to define another. And I think there's room to look at that again. And independent stalking advisors, we know that if a stalking victim is supported by one of those, they have a first of all, they have a much higher chance of getting a protective order in place, and they also have a much better chance of remaining engaged in the criminal justice system. So we do have it in relation to stalking, but not in relation to other offences.
Can I just ask about the criminal justice bill? When do you think it'll be back before Parliament? Because it seems to have just disappeared.
I hope it's on its way back. I think it's on its way back. I understand it's on its way back. I understand it's imminently.
Imminently? Mm. Oh, right. Imminently. Okay. Right. Tim Lawson.
Welcome back, Minister. We're always very nice to former members of the committee who've gone to greater things here, as you know. I want to come back to deep fakes, because the problem is that technology has moved this whole problem on so much and made it much more widespread, much more accessible to all ages. Anybody who's got access to a computer. So on deepfake, I want to know your thinking on this. I mean, I absolutely understand when, in the Online Safety Act, the criminalisation of sharing of deepfakes. Yeah. So now the announcement you made last week about an amendment to the imminent criminal justice bill about just making those deepfakes becomes a criminal offence. And from what I understand, the new law will mean if someone creates a sexually explicit deepfake, even if they have no intent to share it, but purely want to cause alarm, humiliation or distress to the victim, they'll be committing a criminal offence. How do you cause alarm, humiliation or distress to a victim if you're not sharing it?
Yeah. That was, I think, our press notice, and I have to say it was not totally accurate. So it is absolutely right to say that we are creating a criminal offence for somebody who says, I was just going to... The criteria are as follows. First of all, that it was done without the consent of the person. So if the person had consented to some sort of image being made of them, this wouldn't qualify. It must be sexually explicit, which is defined in the legislation in an ordinary way, but with some qualifications so that the police are clear. And thirdly, either that it's done for principally that it's done for the purpose of sexual gratification. We assume for the user who will say they didn't intend to share, but it could be for anybody. So something that's obviously sexually explicit would almost inevitably qualify. But the distinction that was being drawn is that it won't be equivalent to a base offence, which we have for the creation of an intimate image of a real person, which is in our criminal justice bill. So in other words, if you take an intimate image of a person without their consent and you didn't intend to do anything, we're creating a very low-level base offence, and it becomes more serious if there's an intention to cause humiliation, harm or distress or sexual gratification. It's a sexual gratification offence, though. It's going to have wide application. It's not going to be tightly confined, and you're totally right to say that there was a sort of slightly weird construction thing that came out in the press notice, but I've seen the drafting of the provision. It's comprehensive, the threshold is low, and I'll just make one analogy that we've been using in the MOJ, and I think it's quite powerful. It is an offence in this country to create an explosive device, even if you do that in your kitchen and you were planning to let it off in the garden and nobody was going to be affected. And the reason we do that is because if it falls into the wrong hands, or if the motive of the maker changes, it could have catastrophic physical effects. And we're doing this, we're implementing this creating offence in the same spirit, because if the motive of the person changes or it falls into the wrong hands, the psychological consequences for the victim can be profound. And we don't think there should be a distinction, well, more than a sort of obvious distinction between such psychological damage and the kind of physical damage that would flow from the creation of an explosive device.
Okay, so...
just
sorry, yes, please say something.
Just as the Minister has said, then, but precisely because we want to keep it broad, then it's that kind of dual purpose, so it's either sexual gratification or it's intent to cause distress, alarm or humiliation. So it doesn't need to be both, it just needs to be either of those in order to be captured.
The Lord Chancellor and I sat for some time talking to the lawyers, working through what it would and wouldn't say, and I've seen the draft, and it reflects what the Lord Chancellor and I had in mind. It's meant to catch this offence. It's not creating a threshold that's unnaturally high, where people will be able to wriggle out quite easily by saying...
I understand that, and I'm not saying I disagree with it. I'm not playing devil's advocate here, because the problem, and increasingly in this area, and with the emergence of technology, is that we legislate against things which are effectively unenforceable and make for poor legislation. So let's role play. I'm a 17-year-old girl in my bedroom who has used my computer to create an image. How can we draw an example without causing offence? So let's say it has put the Home Secretary's head on a naked image of Arnold Schwarzenegger, for want of a better naked image, that looks exceedingly genuine for her personal sexual gratification, with absolutely no intention of sharing that image. It could be deeply embarrassing to do so, whatever one thinks of the Home Secretary. She would be serious. She would be guilty of a criminal offence.
She will be guilty of a criminal offence, and that's probably not the most realistic example. The most realistic example...
I could have used any example, and you could apply the same terminology. How realistic is that, though?
So let me just give you 3 points, all of which we've considered very carefully. First of all, yes, she'll be committing a criminal offence. There is no custodial sentence for that. There's no custodial sentence, it's just a fine. There's not entry onto the sex offenders register, which isn't the case if the same, and let's be honest, the graphic, the 99% of deepfakes are sexually explicit about women, so let's just sort of be realistic about what we're actually talking about. It would be much more likely to be a male doing this about a young female.
That's irrelevant.
But so they do not...
Why is that relevant?
The creation offence does not put you on the sex offenders register, so it doesn't have those profound consequences that follow from entry on that. You get a criminal record which is quickly expunged if it's just a creation offence. I think the second part of what you're implying, and which is
true... It would come up on a DV check, wouldn't it?
But it would go in the way that any short-term... but yes, it is a criminal...
After how long?
It is a criminal offence. And now that is something I will check and write to the committee on, but it's short and we considered that. Much more serious if you share that image, but creation alone. The other point you're saying is, well, will anyone find out, if they're just doing it? And it's true. There will be a detection issue, but there are other crimes, for example, speeding, where people do it and don't, necessarily get caught every single time they're driving through. But nonetheless, we have the offence, and the offence has added to public protection and contributed to responsible action on the road. And therefore, I still stand by the fact that even though we have gone further than any government has, it is a worthwhile thing to have. And I do maintain that those deepfake creating sites blocking access to UK users, which they're quite right to do, by the way, because they would be criminalising their user base, is a strong positive message that we want to send, that this is completely unacceptable in every single form.
Does it... when does it become a deep fake? So it's only if it's a technologically manipulated image. If I as a 17-year-old girl was to cut out of a magazine a photograph of the head of the Home Secretary and a photograph of the naked body of whoever the celebrity is that an offence as well now?
I believe it is, yes. It's any pseudo image, I believe. But we can check that.
But the reason why it wouldn't be a cutout is that it has to be sexually explicit, and that is defined in a way that is not just intimate image. So it isn't just saucy; it's properly explicit.
Okay, I can buy a pornographic magazine and cut out an image there and stick on the head of the Home Secretary. I will be committing an offence.
I believe so. Yes.
So my concern here, whether it's right or wrong, my concern here is we are potentially treading into the realms of somebody being a little overly creative, particularly younger people, in putting together an image which now transgresses a criminal line when there's no intent to cause any psychological damage to the Home Secretary because he wouldn't know about it, where there's no intent to share it with other people to cause humiliation to the Home Secretary or to share that sexual gratification with others. It's entirely a private, personal matter that nobody need ever find out about, but accidentally they do because my computer falls into the hands of a police investigation because of something else that's going on. That's quite a low bar. One could say, is that doing any harm to anybody?
Just to clarify... I'm just going to come in because Alex and I spent a lot of time going through this. And you're right, you've raised the counter-argument very well, which is surely we're free to do this, surely you're free, there's some degree of leeway, people must be allowed freedom of expression, all of these arguments. So first of all, there are just a few elements. The right to freedom of expression is qualified. You do not have an unqualified right to freedom of expression. And we think that when you're using an image in a non-consensual way, the victim has not consented to the use of their image, then that is relevant. We're moving from an intent-based offence to a consent-based offence, first point. Second point, sexually explicit is defined in such a way, as I say, I want you to move away from a sort of seaside image of boobs and bums to something that is more, and it is defined in the legislation. I've satisfied. We spent a lot of time going through with the MOJ legal team how we would define that, so that it's not the same as the intimate image offence, it's a sexually explicit offence. Point 3, the purpose being sexual gratification. So this isn't just, perhaps an arty thing you're doing on your computer or something. That wouldn't qualify. And in fact, that's, I think, where Amy's going to with the sexual gratification and or the malicious intent, because it's somebody you want to, so we think that the boundary, absolutely, it engages the combination of this consent-based privacy argument for the victim and freedom of expression, but we think we've drawn the line very carefully and we think we've drawn it in the correct place.
We could have a deeply philosophical debate about the freedom of expression, because the freedom of expression surely doesn't apply when you're expressing your freedom to express to yourself. It's entirely internal matter. Freedom of expression, it should be subject to regulation or censorship or the law of some form when you are expressing something that is potentially harmful to somebody else. The 17-year-old girl, is not expressing anything to anybody else, and I'm free to obtain sexual gratification from something, am I not? Because pornography, whether we like it or not, is legally, and so I would have to be 18 here legally, so I was 18 now, I can access pornography legally for sexual gratification, whether or not it has the face of the Home Secretary on another image or not. What's the difference?
The person that you access in the pornographic content has consented to being in that pornographic content. We can have a wider conversation about pornography. The victim of the deep fake has not consented to their image being used in that sexually explicit way, and that is what takes it over the line.
Okay.
So we're criminalising fantasies.
We're criminalising the non-consensual inclusion of the image of a real person in something that is sexually explicit, which has the purpose principally of sexual gratification and or to cause humiliation, alarm or distress. And the lack of consent informs that. And we have to be honest, Tim, when you're talking, giving these examples, we have now got a prolific nudify apps which are coming onto the market all the time.
I completely agree with that.
This is a cancer that is spreading through schools and is predominantly affecting
young girls.
Minister,
I don't disagree.
We accept that this is quite a strong legislative move to make, but we are convinced we have drawn the line in the right place that protects girls.
I don't disagree.
Society broadly would agree.
I don't disagree with any of that, and I absolutely understand the problem. My concern is that potentially we're using a sledgehammer to crack a nut that will just not stand up in terms of practical enforceability. So sharing and trying to cause harm or whatever, absolutely I get that. But unless you are prepared effectively to illegalise pornography, what you've just described in the first part of the issue here is fantasy, and you are effectively, whether we agree with it or not, are criminalising somebody's individual fantasy for sexual gratification.
Right, okay, I think we've
just on to finally on
very
that.
Quickly.
We're not eliminating fantasy. We're not eliminating that. What we are constraining is your right to take the image of a real person, to manipulate that image to create a product which is a deepfake image without their consent that's sexually explicit and that's for your sexual gratification. Right. We're outlawing that.
Thank you. James Daly.
Thank you very much, Minister. Obviously, there are many strands to what we're talking about today, but I'm interested, in terms of my questions to you, regarding the prosecution through the courts of the offending that we're talking about, and I think it goes to a wider general principle. And I don't know whether you heard the evidence that was given on the panel prior to you coming in, but one of the witnesses, who is Assistant Chief Constable, Assistant Chief Constable, put down the police's the level of how sexual offences have been prosecuted and how they have not been prosecuted, probably the best way of putting it. One of the reasons for that has been that the police's attitude has reflected society's wider attitude to, I am assuming, either not taking these offences seriously or perhaps misogyny, whatever it may be. Now, deeply troubling if that is the case, if the police attitude has been, and the way these matters over a period of time have been prosecuted by the police has been impacted by that. And I just wondered what you think about that general principle and how you think, if that is the case, how you as a minister can influence police thinking in this area.
I think it is a really good question. Because it's probably the thing that is the hardest for me to get transparency on, are there general misogynistic attitudes that exist within the police. Of course, we've seen some unbelievably stark examples of that, which have been accompanied by the most serious offending by police officers. But what does the day-to-day look like is a much more difficult task. One of the things I would say, and I've already given this answer partially, is that I think when materials are being produced and training is being developed, it has really, really helped to have specialists designing that training and kind of working with the College of Policing so that there is almost a continuum between whether that's an academic or a specialist group and the frontline officer. So that's the first point. The second point is I think the culture within the police really, really matters. I think each chief officer really, really matters in setting the tone. And I am a bit concerned. I've been speaking to the College of Policing about that. I had correspondence with Andy Marsh this week about things like WhatsApp culture, because I think even though the College of Policing nominally has quite strong principles on this, again and again and again we see smaller groups, subgroups, where cases are described and attitudes are displayed which suggest some of the problematic thinking which make it hard for the public to have confidence. I think there's some work that we need to do on WhatsApp culture. It's been discussed at every level in the Home Office. And then I think the third thing I would say about... I've actually forgotten what I was going to say, sorry.
Well, can I just broaden it? I'll just ask two very quick questions. I think that what you said is a very important point, but I think it's also related. What the situation we've got ourselves into is we have that, which has been accepted by senior police officers and many of the police officers as being a prevalent attitude in the prosecuting and the investigation of these offences. And then you've had an attitude which, if a representative of the CPS was here, they would argue very strongly about the point, and I fully accept there's an argument against this. But we have this very high standard that the CPS are holding the police to, in my view, in respect of evidence that needs to be produced for the basis of a charge for this type of offending. And it seems to me that that's not a relationship or a set of circumstances that is conducive to positive outcomes for victims. And I don't know whether you agree with that.
Well, there's nobody probably with better experience on this particular issue than you, probably sitting in Parliament, actually. I spoke to Stephen Parkinson this week as part of our regular meetings on the rape review, and one of the things that's come out of Soteria, there's still room for improvement on this actually, is closer working between the CPS and the police, and also direct engagement at the very beginning of the process. I think you're making a very strong case actually for the same thing to happen in relation to non-contact sexual offending, and I think it is recognised within the CPS that where they do engage with police officers earlier and tell them more about the expectations they're setting, that they get a better outcome. But I don't think that's always been the case. And to be honest, I think I'll take your question as actually a point that I'll raise again, because I think I understand what you're saying.
Have I got time for one more question?
Yeah. One other point I was going to make, just very briefly.
It's all right, I'm okay chairing. It's all right. James, you can ask one more question, then I'm going to Alison.
Rather than going on to anything else, I just... many of the people who are the victims of this type of offending we're discussing today, or domestic violence or serious sexual offending, are people who may, through no fault of their own have mental health challenges, have addiction problems, have all sorts of other issues in their life. My very real concern and professional experience is that somebody within the system, Minister, is viewing those many of those times when those victims have the courage to come forward as being completely unreliable because of their personal circumstances rather than what they are actually saying about what's happened to them. And I think that goes to explaining why many of the cases that are reported to the police are not put over, are not referred further to the Crown Prosecution Service, because the police are making a judgment on some of those things which they think means that these people are unreliable witnesses. And I think that's a very dangerous place that we've got to. I don't know whether you agree with that.
Well, that came out of the Angelini report, the 2015 allegation of indecent exposure. There was criticism of the individual victim, and I think it was possible to infer that that was exactly that, and I have seen examples of that. So, can I say noted? I'll give that some thought. I think you're making a fair observation. Actually, I have to give some thought as to how we treat that at the Home Office. I don't have an easy response to that. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Chair. We had quite powerful evidence from Lisa Squire, the mother of Libby Squire, which you may have heard. And she said quite powerfully, we've been conditioned over the years to think this is just something that happens. All of these kind of known contact sexual offences. What more do we need to do to change in society to see that this is actually an issue that we should do something about?
I read her evidence on that. I thought she was quite right. I think the number of women who in their lifetime will be the victim of a non-contact sexual offence is incredibly high. And I think actually there has already been progress in the seriousness with which, even just, in fact, upgrading it from public nuisance to a sexual offence in 2003 was the first step in that. I think that the things that have happened in the life of this Parliament, particularly since 2021, have completely changed the way violence against women is treated. And I do think that is treated not just by the police but by the whole of society and the seriousness with which it's viewed. And I do think that this area, and I want to include stalking in it because I think it's really, really important non-contact offence that has its own characteristics. I do think that that is an area where either a specific strategy or the application of what we know to be tried and tested methods, like, for example, an Operation Soteria type investigative method. And I would also say, actually, a recalibration of police data. And one of the things I've been learning, and is, I know the Home Office has a long-term plan to totally change the way the police national database works. But at the moment, the disjoint between the way that certain officers can't access it, the way that some crime is recorded on the police national computer, other more elaborate details are on the police national database, even the data entry skills, the presence of analytic officers, all of that is not where we need it to be for building a complete picture.
Can I ask, what conversations have you had with tech firms? Because I'm pretty sure most women will have had the experience of you being in public transport, for example, and an airdrop appearing. What more can be done to stop these at source?
We've just started seeing the convictions coming through on that. We've got our first conviction on cyber flashing last month. So let me take a bit of time on that. I mean, we've created an offence and we're beginning to see the offence work, so I think it's fair to give that a bit more time before I review whether or not we need to do more on cyber flashing and
Well, I asked that because I asked British Transport Police as well. There had been an FOI put into British Transport Police Scotland to ask how many offences they had recorded. It may be an issue of recording, it may be an issue of data, but they could only find, we've had this as an offence in Scotland for a longer period, they could only find 3 offences from 2019 to 2023. That doesn't suggest to me that even when you have the law there, that you have enough reporting and enough convictions and enough investigations to make this actually happen and be a deterrent.
I have to accept that women have accepted a lot of this stuff for a long time, haven't they? I mean, all of my lifetime, a lot of low-level offending is just not, they don't report.
I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions. The government committed to conducting research on the escalation of sexual offending amongst repeat perpetrators. I just wondered, has that research been published yet?
Not that I'm aware of, but we have got. But we are building really important profiles of repeat perpetrators. In fact, the Met's got its top 100, which is adapted from its terrorism model. And we also know, as a matter of fact, that a small number of perpetrators cause the highest amount of harm. Yeah. So are you expecting to publish this research imminently?
This year.
2024 publication.
2024, okay, right. And also, I just wanted to refer back to the Women and Equalities Committee, where I think you were you were critical about data collection not being good enough. And I just wondered if you could say something about, has anything been done to improve that since you appeared at the Women and Equalities Committee? And are you satisfied that policing have got sufficient data analysis resource in place?
So the analytics conversation is one I have had with the policing minister, so I can update the committee. One of the things I have explored is the possibility of a workaround. So we know that a busy frontline officer on the beat somebody might come in with some sort of offence. They want to look up, which I've been looking at this in the context of actually protective orders, because we know that the police are not getting as many of these as possible. We've got a piece of work on protective orders, which we haven't got time for. But the police use the police national computer, and they would like to look at the police national database. But sometimes you get a situation where nobody in the station that night has got a license to access the database. They might intend to go back to it when they're back in the next day, but because of the caseload, they just don't. So I have explored, or I'm interested in whether or not you should simply have a sort of very simple system where the facts of the case get recorded, and the first person with a license to use the database has got to work through all of those, because I think some of that gets lost altogether. And whether we have a sort of next day, next shift, day shift, somebody has to go through everything, because I don't think that is always happening. Now, that's a workaround for a longer term solution, which must mean much greater accessibility to the national database, actually a much simpler form of being able to record data. I think sometimes, particularly with RASO offences, the data entry thing is quite elaborate, and it also asks questions which are not necessarily relevant, and it takes too long for a standard officer just to get to the most direct question, like, for example, what's the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim, which is probably the most important detail we need for data.
Okay, I think the committee is quite concerned about workforce within policing and making sure that we've got the right people with the right skills in place. And we did make a recommendation in our policing priorities report about that workforce plan that we thought would be quite useful for the future of policing. I think the government decided they didn't agree with that, but we would again, I think, say that there are clear issues here around recruitment of people with the right skills for data analysis. We just put that to you, Minister. And the second point I just wanted to raise with you, we're also in the middle of an inquiry into the Fire and Rescue Service and culture. You've made reference today about WhatsApp groups, and we know in policing there have been real concerns about the use of WhatsApp groups, expressing culture that is not appropriate. Just ask you, Minister, whether you might want to have a word with the policing minister, who's got responsibility for fire and rescue as well, about some of the stories yesterday in the media about WhatsApp groups. I think it was in Shropshire.
I just want to reassure you that the conversations about WhatsApp groups have been had at every single level with at the Home Office, including with the Home Secretary.
Good. Well, I'm very pleased to hear that. We are concerned about the culture, particularly in the Fire and Rescue Service, which we've come across in our recent inquiry. So just so you're aware of that as well. But can I thank you very much and your officials today for coming along. We're very pleased that we were able to hear from you, and can I commend you on how well briefed you were on this important subject to the Home Affairs Select Committee. So thank you very much. Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.